Hey guys, it's Briars. Just want to tell you what's going on down at Meltdown Comics in Hollywood. We got Meltthology. Meltthology is a monthly comics jam at Meltdown every third Tuesday of the month. Here's how it works. Show up at the Melt at 7 p.m. and draw a page of whatever you want. At 9:30 p.m., we'll collect all of the art and $3 for printing costs. When you come to the next month's comics jam, you'll get a zine with everyone's contributions inside. There is no set theme, and all skill levels are welcome. Last but not least, Meltthology contributors get 10% off their Meltdown purchase on the night of the event. Go to @Meltthology on Twitter or Facebook if you have any specific questions. Ask for Chuck, and that is @Melt_thology.
Welcome back to Pod Sequentialism. I'm your host, Matt Kennedy, recording live at Meltdown Comics and Collectibles. There's always stuff going on in here, so if you hear any kind of strange noise in the background, it's because all hell is breaking loose at the Nerdist. I want to give a big shout out really quickly to our in-house producer and audio engineer, Mason Booker, who's been really helping out with not just this podcast, but pretty much every podcast here at the Meltcast. So I want to give a big hey to Mason. How you doing today?
Hey, how's it going? Thanks.
Very well, very well. So the topic for today's show is going to be comic art as fine art. And I'm not sure how many of you know, I am the gallery director at La Luz de Jesus Gallery in Los Angeles, which is considered one of the seminal art galleries to bring underground comic book art forward as fine art. We gave very early shows in the 1980s to Robert Williams, S. Clay Wilson, Robert Crumb, Victor Moscoso, Spain Rodriguez, and a lot of the Zap comic book artists. And then we kind of broadened out. We've shown Kenny Scharf and some very interesting fine artists who may qualify as blue chip artists these days. And then brought it forward through the poster art movement and gave Frank Kozik his first show, and people like Coop, who did the Devil Girl stuff, and the Piz, and they did a lot of the Jabberjaw posters. Kind of really kicked off the second wave of silk screening. And that's important because of, if you recall the pop art movement in its grand glory, what really launched them was the use of silkscreen and the exaggerated presence of printed colored dots. And the two most prolific of those fine artists from the 1960s were, of course, Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein. Now, last year at Christie's, there was an auction in which 3 Andy Warhol paintings broke all records for previous Andy Warhol sales. And there was a very large diptych of a car crash that went for, if I'm not mistaken, $65 million. This is a silkscreen.
That's amazing.
Yeah, this is very high pricing. And routinely, pieces by Roy Lichtenstein go for in the single-digit millions and the tens of millions. And I'm sure that you're going to see a sharp rise with the rise of Andy Warhol over this past year. Now, what many people are sort of generally aware of, but not specifically aware of, is how these artists used appropriation to create their art form. They didn't make their own images. They made kind of crude copies of existing comic art panels.
Are you basically saying plagiarism?
Yes, it's basically plagiarism.
I got you. Okay.
Yes. And I think by today's standards, there would be no question. It would absolutely qualify as plagiarism. I can give you at least 10 counts of artistic plagiarism that were leveled against Jeff Koons. There were at least 7, maybe as many as 11 lawsuits against Damien Hirst. Most of these have been settled out of court. In the recent maybe month and a half, there's been a couple of street artists who have sued high fashion labels for implementing their specific tags into their couture high fashion costuming and runway stuff.
Oh, like on the clothing?
Yes, directly on the clothing.
Interesting.
There was a Katy Perry red carpet thing. Yeah. And she was wearing one of these appropriated images for a which designer was it? He does the Adidas with the wings.
I don't know.
It'll come to me.
Okay.
But a major gaffe, and Moschino was the clothing design that made the clothing. So these lawsuits are becoming more common, and whereas before it was kind of a given that the artist being ripped off, there was an artist who was ripped off by Starbucks. They had actually contacted her to create art for them.
The logo?
No, esoteric kind of like decorative wear.
Like they on the walls or whatever.
Or even on cups and stuff for like
Sure.
specific locations. They often hire regional artists to do the regional design.
Mm-hmm.
So they contacted this particular female artist and didn't go with her design when she quoted them her price. And they kind of just had somebody do a very similar version of what she had done. Her lawsuit is still pending. It's been going on for quite a while. And the fear was that it would be dismissed.
Yeah.
Because that happens so often.
Oh, sure.
But because it's still going on, there's a belief that the current attitude towards intellectual copyright of art is starting to change. But every time there's a good thing, there's a bad ruling.
Mm.
So Richard Prince, who is very famous for having taken the old Marlboro Man ads from the 1970s, and he worked in I think he worked at BBDO, but one of the larger ad agencies. He worked in a filing department. He would have access to all these great original images, so he would take pictures of the images and then blow them up and appropriate them, and it was now elevated to fine art.
Yeah, that's the deal, right? Like you transform what was once corporate into art.
Right. Now the argument is, how much has he transformed it? So how much of his hand was in his piece, say, as opposed to the previous piece? And he got into a big stink, his first big controversy, and this may predate the Cowboys, I'm not sure. It's in the same era, was the famous shot of Brooke Shields that was published in Playboy magazine, or was it in Playboy or was it in Penthouse? I think it might have been in Penthouse, of her from the movie Pretty Baby, and she's of course underage and naked.
Oh yeah, right.
And so it caused
With,
huge controversy.
Susan Sarandon.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
gotcha.
in the Louis Malle film.
Right.
And she plays a girl who grows up in this brothel in New Orleans.
Brothel in Louisiana. It was based on real events.
Yes.
They had underage prostitution in the area. It was called Sugar Town or something like that.
Yeah. Good recall.
Yeah.
Very good recall.
Sorry, yeah.
This is completely unrehearsed, everybody.
No reason that I know that.
The fact that Mason has pulled this out is very impressive.
I'm a bit of a film buff. So Pretty Baby, I studied a lot of production design off of, because I did a short film that was based in the 1800s as well.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, it was cool.
So you appropriated the
I was inspired by.
Yes, inspired by. We'll use that. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So now with Richard Prince, he actually took a photo of the magazine and blew it up as his own fine art object, and it caused controversy because of the imagery, not so much for the fact that he had appropriated it. This was in the middle of Brooke Shields had a very long running lawsuit where she had said that she never gave her permission to be photographed at that age. She had a lawsuit going against her mother, I believe, who had okayed it, and she sued and rightfully won access to the negatives that produced this particular photo shoot.
Cool.
And so this is a good thing. And there was another case very recently for a French actress named Eva Ionesco, whose mother was Irina Ionesco, whose father was Eugene Ionesco, the surrealist poet.
Okay.
And so Irina and Ava had a very tumultuous relationship, and she sued and claimed irreparable harm to her entire existence and upbringing.
Sued the father?
The mom.
Oh, the mom. Okay.
Yeah, and it took like forever, like
Yeah.
30 years. And
Well, how are you going to prove something like that?
well, I mean, her stuff was a bit racier, let's say, than Brooke Shields.
Oh.
Yeah, it was.
I'm unfamiliar.
Yeah, it was definitely on the edge of questionable taste. She was very much dolled up to look like a sex object, and was often photographed. It wasn't like one or two. It was books
Wow.
and books of her mother's photography
Oh,
starring her.
So her mother would shoot her
Yes.
and then what? Sell these photos?
These books, yeah, and have exhibitions of
Wow.
you know,
under an art pretense.
yes, and you're talking like platinum gel prints that were probably thousands of dollars then and are probably tens of thousands of dollars now.
Oh, surely.
Now she won her lawsuit, and it took a very, very long time. I spoke to her about it in 1997.
Wow, you got congratulations, man. You get I gotta say, like a little producer side note, you get the most amazing interviews. I've never seen it, especially on a podcast format. But yeah.
Oh, and I guess I should say this for people that don't know. In a lot of the late '90s, I was on the Ricky Rackman radio show here in Los Angeles at KLSX. I was Flickhead. I was their film critic.
Oh, okay.
And I did the drive time slot. We had the largest audience in Los Angeles, and so it was a great fun job. I love working with Ricky. I had worked with him at the Cat House when it was the nightclub that all the hair metal bands played at.
Wow.
When I first come to LA. But my meeting with Miss Ionesco was actually set up through a film licensing friend, and she had a film that she had released as an adult that was available, and we looked at it for possible acquisition, and she owned the film. She was the producer, and so we had this conversation. It's very pleasant, and we're about the same age. She's a little bit older than me, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had no idea that she had been this kind of child model phenomenon in Europe at this earlier time, and she did seem like really upset by it. Now, when she got the rights back to all the imagery, she actually released a book of her own photographs from that era. And so it kind of maybe belittles the idea of it being damaging, but you could say that it was an empowerment now that she was in control of her own exploitation.
Yeah, I would say that it's more of a working through it.
Right.
Confronting the trauma and then working through it to make it your own.
Yeah, and I embrace that. And
Sure.
I'm completely supportive of whatever she could get back from what was
an
unpleasant experience.
Get your bread, girl.
So now, when you talk about appropriation now, and Richard Prince was also recently sort of exposed by his Instagram show where he printed these large format images of other people's Instagram feeds where he would comment on their page something completely ridiculous. And what he would post proved that he had no idea really what Instagram was. So rather than it being the usage of social media to connect in a real way with a youth audience, it just showed what a chasm he had between that youth culture that he was trying to exploit and his own ideas about what that medium was.
So was the point of the taking of the images, was the point actually his comment rather than what he was appropriating?
I think that would be his point.
Gotcha.
In court, that that by him having his own quote at the bottom of it, he was adding value to someone else's photograph. Now, he did not approach anybody for permission and just printed them.
Sure.
So one of the victims, if you will,
Sure,
or targets of his appropriation were the Suicide Girls.
Oh, hey, of course.
And so they went and they printed the exact same image that he used. His were selling at the Gagosian Gallery in New York City for $90,000. They made theirs available for $90,000.
Nice.
So I bought a couple.
Yeah, as the good move, Suicide Girls.
And they're perfect kind of bootlegs, like perfect bootlegs. And I love that they did this. The notion of being targeted for appropriation, and rather than cause a big ugly fight, to cause marketplace confusion via producing the exact same object, which you also have a right to do if he has a right to do it.
Sure, because it was yours originally.
Yeah, has a kind of amazing quality. So we digress and we go back to the original focus of this kind of appropriation, and we look at Roy Lichtenstein. So I came across, oh my gosh, maybe 15 years ago, a website, and I don't think it exists as the site that it was then, but I can give everybody the name of the man who set it up. And the guy's name is David Barsalou, and that's spelled Barsalou. And he put together a painstakingly assembled collection of most source images that became Roy Lichtenstein paintings.
That's awesome.
The actual panels, the actual comics, the information about who the the penciler and inker were, if possible.
Yeah, that's awesome because I have to say, as a casual observer, I'm not in the art world to your level, but obviously I'm familiar with Roy Lichtenstein, and I've often wondered, as I gaze upon these comic panels, clearly comic book panels, what are these from? You know,
Right,
they look like they're taken from something else.
They are unattributed. And recently, actually, there's a group of kind of public artists. I won't say they're graffiti artists because I think they would object to the word graffiti in the context of what they do. But I also think that people who consider themselves graffiti artists wouldn't consider the Panic Collective, it's Panic with a K collective, would not consider them graffiti artists, but more outdoor public art, guerrilla artists or something, art terrorists maybe.
I guess I don't know where to draw the distinction, but that's an interesting concept.
And we'll get into that for sure, because
yeah.
I think that's ripe for the discussion.
Yeah.
But they replied to a post on Instagram by Art Forum magazine, which is arguably the most important contemporary art publication, in the United States and therefore probably the world. And they ran a retro post, like a Throwback Thursday or a Flashback Friday post, featuring them putting Roy on the cover of their magazine back in 1962. And they ran his title. And the Panic Collective went in and ran Kind of a Shame on You and gave the actual artist's name. And it was I believe it was a John Buscema drawing.
Cool.
But if it wasn't John Buscema, you know what? It was Irv Novick. It was an Irv Novick drawing. And they're like, this should be after, Irv Novick, because he was never attributed by Roy Lichtenstein. Now, at least when Richard Prince has appropriated an Instagram image, you have on that appropriated image, now blown up to 6 feet tall or whatever, the name of the account that he took it from. So you've got kind of an automatic credit right there. I mean, I don't know that that was important to Richard Phillips, but he understood, at least to the degree that he understood what social media is, that was part of what made it recognizable.
I admire what's going on. It sounds like kind of art street justice.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, so they called out Art Forum, which is kind of a dangerous thing to do in the art world.
Sure.
But it made me think back to David's page, and I started to go through, and I want to draw attention to a couple of names here, because I think that most people assumed that what Roy was doing was paying tribute to the art form of comic book art, and perhaps doing his own drawings along the lines of something that you might see in a comic book. I don't think that the public at the time was even actively aware that these were straight lifts of panels from comics.
Yeah, when I first saw them, much younger, I assumed that he did these himself.
I did too.
Yeah.
I did too. And I loved Roy's stuff.
Yeah, it's very iconic.
Because it was, to me, elevating comic book art to art.
For me, it was, like I said, I was pretty young at the time, but it was just so poppy, and the colors were so interesting, and the stills that he chose, the panels, were so dramatic that it as a young boy, I couldn't help but wonder, what are these stories about? What are these women crying about, and whatever. And I thought it was amazing.
Yeah, there was, especially, I guess, definitely more so in the 1960s and 70s and even 80s than today, that most adolescent boys reading comics would have no idea what a romance comic looked like.
No way.
Yeah, they didn't really even exist much after 1974.
Yeah, I was definitely catching the tail ends of them, like in the Sunday comics, as I was a very small child, and Mary Worth and all that stuff.
Yeah, and the Sunday Funnies aspect of it. And I think a lot of people thought that they were actually dailies or Sunday comics.
I certainly did.
Yeah, and didn't realize that they were certain panels from existing comic books of the era, like Modern Romance, Millie the Model. There was a lot of stuff from the war comic, Star Spangled War stories. So there's Joe Kubert pieces that he took.
Oh, that's awesome. I've never heard of any of this stuff, so this is fascinating.
Yeah, and I mean, beyond Jack Kirby, there were a lot of Jack Kirby pages,
Sure.
and you would expect that there would be. And like I said, there were some John Buscema's. There was William Overgaard, who's kind of a not many people remember him because he was one of those kind of nameless, faceless grinder workmen, journeyman comic book guys that worked at a studio with like 10 other artists, and you'd have maybe Joe and Jack would be in the office, and maybe John and Marie Severin, and of course John Severin was somebody whose artwork was lifted by Roy Lichtenstein.
Wow.
We already said Irv Novick, Mike Sikowski, the guy that was behind a lot of the DC comic stuff. He was doing Justice League. He was doing a lot of their superhero team books. He was doing Brave and the Bold, but he also, just like Jack, was a journeyman who could pick up work in any genre.
I think this is one of the things that I find most fascinating about your show is you shine these spotlights onto the lesser known grunt workers, since you called them that I certainly don't know. But you're like, no, they've actually formed a tremendous basis of what you're a fan of. Like your interview with Stephen Bissett was
yeah. I mean,
blew me away. I was like, what? Worked on it. Watchmen, and I'm sorry, Swamp Thing. What? Yeah. Who's this guy? Oh, he's amazing. Like,
yeah, and and of course he was, he would say that he was raised on the shoulders of people like Joe Kubert, and he went to Joe's school. He was part of the first graduating class from the Joe Kubert school.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, and so Tony Abruzzo, I think maybe the most famous of the Lichtenstein steals were the Tony Abruzzo ones. And Tony Abruzzo is almost completely forgotten by comic book historians.
I've never heard of him.
Yeah, I mean, he was really a grinder, and he was a guy that worked on the titles nobody else wanted to draw. I mean, he was working, and Dick Giordano, who became very famous. He was a vice editor, a vice president at DC Comics. He was in charge of Charlton at a certain point. I think he was even at Gold Key, and Dick was a guy that could ape a lot of styles, and he came before, if I'm not mistaken, people like Neil Adams. And so there's an era there where you can't tell Dick stuff from Neil's.
Wow.
I mean, it's that much. But Tony Abruzzo was also, like, he could do a house style. And, we know Dick, and Dick was his contribution to comics was tremendous. And we don't remember Tony Abruzzo as much. We definitely don't remember William Overgaard as much. And then there's Bob Grant and Bob Totten, Totten. These guys worked as a team the way that Simon and Kirby worked as a team. And neither one of them, to my knowledge, ever really went solo. They'd work on stuff.
Do you think that was a reflection of the time that they were in? Like they didn't really push for people to go solo, whereas nowadays it's like, oh, you're doing well, man. Like, go solo.
I don't think they were even ever credited.
Wow.
It was such a different world.
Sure.
And especially in the romance market. I've got some Kirby pages that I've picked up over the years from the romance comics. I kept one specifically that when I bought it, it was attributed to Vince Colletta. Mm-hmm. And certainly Vince did pencil. But if you know a Vince Colletta page from a Jack Kirby page, and a page that maybe before Vince started erasing the lines in the superhero work because he was taking on 20 titles a month.
Yeah.
And Jack wouldn't let him do it, and Jack hated working with him after a while because he was like, why do I bother spending this time if this guy is an inker, is just going to do the bold line? But I have a page from one of the romance comics, which was obviously a huge influence on Dave Stevens. The girl, the bust line, everything about it just looks like Dave. And when I saw this in a pile of pages from a comic book art vendor years ago, I had to have it. It's something that I hope I keep until I die, and I hope I live a long time.
Yeah.
But it just reflected to me how versatile Jack was in being able to do all these different styles. And because that was the era, a lot of these guys were like that. Joe Orlando, another guy whose work was stolen by Roy Lichtenstein. And, he was one of the mainstays at EC Comics. He did the Tales from the Black Freighter pages in the Watchmen.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And and actually Tony Orlando, I think, is the guy that helped bring over all the Filipino talent in the 1970s that helped work at DC, Marvel, and of course at Warren Publications. Doing the deep page stories for Creepy and Eerie and Vampirella and that type of thing.
So, I have a question.
Sure.
So Roy clearly was ripping off massive amounts of people, and they all worked for relatively big name comic book companies at some point. Did none of these comic book companies notice or care about Roy's blatant appropriation?
As far as I know, none of them ever contacted him.
Huh.
And remember too that the people at the legal departments at comics in the 1950s and especially early 60s, and especially pre-superhero artwork, where you had Stan Lee, editor-in-chief at Marvel after it had switched over from Timely, that the legal team was really there to control the artists and freelancers who worked for them.
Oh, so it wasn't so much about intellectual property.
Except when there was a claim on title, and it didn't happen too often, and it tended to happen a lot later. So you have the famous Marvel lawsuit against Captain Marvel, which was a character that existed before Marvel Comics, but it had gone out of print for a while, and when DC tried to bring back Captain Marvel, then Marvel tried to file a suit, which I believe they lost.
Huh.
But when Marvel Man, which had been published, and then over in England when Alan Moore revived the character, when that was coming to the U.S. through an independent comics company, and was it First or was it Comico? Eclipse. I think Eclipse was putting out Marvel Man as part of their package deal with a bunch of English titles.
They were putting it out in England?
In America.
Oh, in America.
Yeah, so it got released as Miracle Man because
Right.
Marvel sued. And that's what caused that big fiasco and hold up on that title for like 20 years when...
Yeah, and I think I read they just re-released it.
Now, I don't know that Neil Gaiman ever finished the story because I don't think he ever got paid for the last portion that he wrote. So I'm not sure if that was completed, if they came to a deal on that. And I have to admit that I'm a little bit out of the loop on this one.
I think that's what I don't, unfortunately I can't, you can't quote me on it, but I think that I just read that they just finished it.
Okay.
That because, and I read the article because, I obviously have never heard of Miracle Man, but, they were all saying that it's one of the greatest things ever written, and it's one of the greatest things ever made and stuff. And they just re-released. I think they were releasing it as either a trade paperback or a 4-volume set.
They did individual comics, and then they're binding them, I think, in 4 individual trade paperbacks. And the original writer of this retelling the story is Alan Moore, and the original artist was Gary Leach. Brilliant stuff. Yeah. And then Mark Buckingham took over for Gary Leach, and Rick Veitch came and did some fill-in issues. So it was a lot of the same guys that had been working together at DC.
That's cool.
And then Alan got frustrated and decided to kind of leave off.
Well,
and
he's Alan Moore. He lives in the mists.
He's a wizard.
Yeah.
And so you've got this weird opportunity where they ask, who's going to take this over? And I believe Grant Morrison wanted to throw his name in the hat. And I know that he has said that he felt that Alan Moore blocked him from taking over the character. But at some point, Neil Gaiman came into the picture, and he told a very different story. That came out in that era where I'd first fallen out of comics, and I didn't get to read those until years later. And those issues are so much rarer because the circulation had gone down, that they're generally selling for hundreds of dollars or something per issue in mint or near mint.
Wow.
And so it took me a while to catch up, and I didn't catch all the way up because it hadn't all come out yet, which is the most frustrating thing ever, right?
When you're waiting and searching. And,
And now I know what the Trekkies felt like, who felt, after that original series that, there was unresolved issues.
Yeah, a lot of hanging.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what brings us full circle on this is that the companies that own the copyright technically to these pages could not be bothered.
Yeah, fascinating to me because in today's world that would never happen. Money to be made.
Yeah. I mean, and even if it's not going to the artist, the company
Yeah, that when I said money to be made,
Yeah.
I meant to the company.
Oh,
yeah.
of course. You would see, some weird little copyright line below it if that was something that you could still sue for. Now, there is kind of a Wild West mentality to a high degree of appropriation, but I think the court of public opinion weighs in. And at a certain point, if the court of public opinion judges you guilty, you are guilty, and that has an effect. Now, if you're Damien Hirst and you've already made $500 million, it doesn't really matter. And when he's losing his suits, he's losing a lot of money, and he's losing it out of court. And I'm not sure how much satisfaction the artists get, but they're certainly making more money than they ever did if they win their cases.
Sure.
In the case of something like what Richard Prince is doing, it's a little harder to kind of aim at because he is changing it ever so slightly. And he's already won a very famous lawsuit, which people felt like, oh, well, now we can never sue for this. And now this other case that's coming up is maybe shining a light on the fact that, well, you know what? If you steal my art, I can go after you. And there's been like a lot of cases against not Hot Topic, and now I feel bad that I've said that because that will be the brand that sticks in everybody's head. And maybe they're guilty. It's not who I'm thinking of. But Urban Outfitters has been sued many times by artists who feel that they've stolen their design and just drawn it differently. And if you're talking about like a T-shirt is inherently a high concept item. I mean, it's the idea is what sells the shirt, maybe not so much the graphic.
Well, sure. I mean, anytime I go to a concert or a sporting event or anything, there's somebody who has either blatantly stolen the logo or ever so slightly altered it, and they're selling them like right there, $20 a pop, because they know, these will sell.
And then there's like that. I mean, when I first came out to LA, you'd see people selling bootleg shirts outside the Palladium or something. Actually, Gaston and I used to always try and pull a free shirt out of those guys.
Oh, nice.
But and they'd give them up actually half the time. But and that's kind of a whole different thing. Now they could defend themselves in a way, unless the band or the holding company sued them on a marketplace confusion type of lawsuit, which is similar to a suit that Walt Disney Corporation filed against the creator of the Air Pirates comic book in the 1970s, and that kind of came to a standstill after 40 years and bankruptcies.
Well, when you go against Disney, it's a tough battle.
But he waited him out. That's the funny thing about that guy.
I'm impressed.
He waited him out. I think he felt like after 3 years and one bankruptcy, he was like, I'm never going away. And he never expected it to take that long, but he felt like 3 years was past his breaking point.
Sure.
And then it just kept going on and going on and going on. And he's like, nope, not going anywhere. And it went to arbitration, and they had tried to say, plagiarism, and then it was judged to be a work of artistic merit, even though it was a pornographic parody. And so it fell under satire, and then they tried to say marketplace confusion because the cover was basically identical to the Walt Disney's Comics and Stories cover, but 10 years had passed. So the cover price was different, and the odds of there being this comic on a rack where children could access it was null. It was not going to happen. So they couldn't win on that, and they kept coming at him with all these different ideas, and finally they exhausted every possible thing. And what they could try to go on the very final one, it's a very hard case to win, especially against a company that size, is damage to reputation. And it ended up going to arbitration. And as I understand it, and forgive me if I'm not to the letter correct, the judgment was that it was a matching foul of sorts. That if he agreed to never do it again, then there would be no recourse. And one of the rulings of the arbitration was that each party had to take care of their own legal fees.
Oh, wow.
So that protected him from a potential, $300 million? What does Disney pay for lawyers?
What were his legal fees? I mean,
probably in the tens of millions over 40 years.
Yeah, right. That's what
But theirs.
Oh, I'm sure that would,
Yeah, a team of lawyers working around the clock for 40 years. Yeah. It's like, how much money did Titanic make? But the, that there's hope now, at least to an extent, that you do have a type of recourse in the court if a corporation takes your stuff. And even if you sign a contract, and I hope that everybody who has ever signed a contract, and if you are involved in wanting to do comics, or you have any kind of agreement deal with a company, a first look deal, and this happens to musicians all the time, when they sign a deal memo and they feel like they are entrapped by signing a deal memo, and it's yes and no, that the court will always side with the party that did not draft the contract on any non-specific, unarticulated points. So if there's any point of contention and you didn't write the contract, they'll side with you over any miscommunication. Almost always.
That's reassuring.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I mean, this has been a good protection in a lot of copyright claim lawsuits, that a company has a general policy and then the law changes, but they still send out that same contract because they haven't changed it, which means that contract is not legally binding because it wasn't legal when it was signed. And that has been a really good escape. Now the companies are a little bit more adept at it, and when you see that there are major lawsuits, that arguments that, like, say, DC used to use on why a character created as a version of another character, like if you create Super Kid, or and in that respect Super Billy Goat, that because it's an offshoot character of Superman, you aren't entitled to. They've changed their ruling, so now that a different reason protects in the same way that the old reason would not have.
Wow.
It's very confusing, and so there are a lot of people that are on the payroll who have created characters over the years that are like, well, wait a minute, you just sent me this different reason for this contract to not pay me than you sent me for this other reason on this other contract, and they're the opposite. So you're paying me on one of these.
Yeah.
Which one are you going to pay me on?
Right.
And then they stop answering the phone, and then they end up settling out of court, I imagine. But this has been pretty common in the last couple of years. Now, when we look at the great crime that Roy Lichtenstein has created against Jack Kirby, William Overgaard, Bob Grant, and Bob Totten, Irv Novick, Mike Sikowski, Tony Abruzzo, Dick Giordano, ad infinitum, Tony Orlando, all these guys, there is no recourse.
I was gonna say, but
half these guys, more than half these guys are dead.
I can't believe he's gonna get away with it.
And he's dead.
That's crazy.
It's like there's nowhere for this to go.
So the Roy Lichtenstein estate or whatever can't dole out post-mortem payments to the other estates?
I mean, I
don't know.
I don't know that there's a precedent for it. Maybe now that Jack Kirby's estate has come to terms with Marvel, accepted an out of court settlement, that window opens again for the possibility of someone to say, hey, I own that image. Not just, with Jack, it's the characters, it's the creation of the characters. But since Roy's milieu was to take specific iconic images, there should still be that possibility open. And certainly they didn't even enter into a contract with him.
Sure. I mean, not even a verbal one. But doesn't that also go back to what you were saying earlier about how since Roy blew it up and changed the medium on which it was printed, was that changing it enough to be art as opposed to a ripoff?
The biggest problem that the estates face is the statute of limitations. That the statute of limitations for when these works were created is long ago eclipsed.
Oh, because now they're in public domain.
No, not that they're in public domain, but that you only had 3 years to file a claim.
So the artists had 3 years from the time that Roy did it to file a claim,
right?
But they didn't, and so now
on the original paintings. But that doesn't necessarily hold over to newly produced prints of Roy Lichtenstein's paintings, which copy, say, Irv Novick's drawings.
Right.
So there could be, if new works are produced based upon that image, a little bit of leeway, and we'll see if anybody does anything about it. I think that the public shaming of Roy Lichtenstein is probably where it's really going to cause a difference.
Yeah. So if Roy's estate unleashes a new run of his prints, then the other estates can attack that now.
Foreseeably, yes, because it is now a new work based on an old theft.
This is complicated.
Yeah, I mean, this is why law books
lawyers.
Are so thick.
Yeah, do it.
They've invented a new language to charge you to read you common sense. But and no offense to any lawyers, for people who are unaware, and this ties very much into this, and especially the idea of comic book art as fine art, not just in the acceptable sense that there are pieces that are derived from that are considered fine art by every reasonable human being on earth. We've also got a show that opened last week at California State University in Northridge, curated by Sam Humphries, called Comic Book Apocalypse, The Graphic World of Jack Kirby. And it brings together a treasure trove of every different aspect of work that Jack produced, much of it original. You get to see original pages that he drew. I know that there are certain people I know that have key pages were contacted to loan them to the exhibition. I got a hold of Sam a little bit too late to include any of the stuff that we owned. But we are definitely helping to get the word out about this because Jack was the king. Jack was a very gracious man. I used to go visit him he lived in Northridge, for a good maybe 40 years.
Oh, wow. So
after he moved out of New York, he went straight to California.
And you used to go hang.
I didn't go hang. I would ride 3 or 4 buses from Hollywood to go visit Jack to buy comic book art because I'd heard that he had just gotten all the art, the original art pages, not all of it, but the bulk of the pages from Marvel that he had sued to get. If you remember, back in the day, Eclipse Comics had an ad on the back of every comic book that said Marvel Comics is celebrating its 25th anniversary. What about Jack? And they sort of sued and shamed him. He's like, okay, well, you're not going to pay me for my creations. At least give me back the artwork.
Interesting.
Yeah, because he didn't even have the pages to sell. They kept them.
Well, right, because at that point you were work for hire, right? Or I don't know.
There's a lot of reasons why he actually was able to settle out, maybe because he wasn't a payroll guy.
Gotcha.
And that you're not bound by those rules, and therefore there's a whole different thing. It's a whole different aspect.
Interesting.
But without getting too deep into that issue, and I'm sure we'd love to do a show with Sam, and we'd love to do a show with Jack's granddaughter. And I'm sure at some point we will. I know that she just moved to college and is we were going to do a show with her a couple of days ago, and she had to up and move. I think she's in Memphis.
Oh, wow.
Just moved. But and she's been really carrying the torch for the Jack Kirby estate. And
yeah, we've gotten several messages from her. She's in talks over there.
Very, very sweet girl.
Yeah.
And also very close to the Hero Initiative, who are, a charity that I love working with. I have worked with. I got to spend a day with Russ Heath, driving him from appointment to appointment and hearing all of his amazing stories about life at the Playboy Mansion and a lot of other stuff that's probably not fit for a podcast.
Sure.
But or not our PG rated podcast. But the strength of having a show like this is another second reinforcement that the actual medium of comic book art, of sequential art, is fine art in and of itself. It's a point that built this podcast. The podcast is called Pod Sequentialism because my show was called Pop Sequentialism when I got together the modern stuff, and it was the first exhibition of its type. It was in 2011, and every time you have an amazing exhibition of the classics, it just reignites the flame for modern work, and vice versa. Whenever you see a heritage auction and McFarlane cover sells for $675 million, that's got to be good news for a really classic page. And I'm not bagging on Todd McFarlane. I think he was a great penciler, but I'm amazed that he holds the current record for comic book art cover.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think a lot of that is just he, through some magic whimsy, developed such an incredible cult following that, the fanaticism is what buoys him. Not to say that he's not talented, but I mean, there are others. Yeah.
I mean, I would certainly rather own the cover of Avengers #1,
right?
Or even Mad Magazine #2.
Sure.
Going back to the EC era and that whole unsung crew of amazing artists. But the auction prices are an interesting thing, and they help to motivate the market, but they also help build an awareness for the market at large. I've always said, if you buy an original comic book art page, you're not just buying that page. You're buying the entire history of the character. You're buying the entire relationship between the artist and writer that made that page. If it's an old enough page, it's got the lettering on it too. It was probably inked by somebody else. You're talking about a one-of-a-kind collaboration, the likes of which just really generally does not exist otherwise in fine art.
Yeah, and I think this lends credence to your point about comics being fine art, because I know that several friends of mine have, they've been reading a comic or whatever, and there's one panel or one particular page that has, really connected with them, really moved them on some deep level, and they literally exacto it out, and they'll frame it and hang it in their house and be like, that's the one that changed my life, put me on this new path, or helped me get over my divorce, or whatever. I don't know.
Cutting a panel out of a page gives me the willies.
Yeah,
but
I
I respect them for doing that. But that's what we would call a holy grail image. That
Sure.
When you're collecting comic art, there's only one of that. That there's only one original pencil page, and even if you can get that artist to recreate it, it's not the same. And that's more common nowadays. They never have the same panache as the original, but that you have to be so lucky that if you're reading a comic book and you come across this one page which is life-changing, if you didn't get that page that month, like the day that comic came out,
Right.
you'll probably never get it. And if you get a chance at it again, that's like a once in a lifetime opportunity.
Yeah.
And we've all had these. We've all had these moments where we had our shot to buy something and we passed and we'll never see it again. But none more so, and perhaps none more soul destroying than missing out on
Superman #1.
Yeah, or like I say, if it was even like a page from, it could be a page from X-23 or whatever. It could be like just that page that you love, that you remember from the first comic you ever bought, and you dropped the comic and you picked it up to that page and it just transfixed you. It could be, for me, I think the first comic that I remember owning as like its own thing was Werewolf by Night #32. That Moon Knight cover.
Yeah.
And keeping it and finding it, and then years later when I realized that comic books were collectible and saw an episode of Simon and Simon, and then I looked in the yellow pages for a bookstore that had comics listed in their ad, and I rode my bike further downtown than I'd ever ridden it before and found this dumpy little store with these great guys that were just a couple years older than me arguing about, whether or not Swamp Thing was the greatest comic book ever written. And there was like Swamp Things on the wall, and there was like,
was it during the Stephen Bissett run?
It was right fresh.
There you go.
So like I think there was only 6 issues out, and I kind of quietly walked over to the S's and I picked up these comics and I brought them up, and this guy's like, he's like, "Oh, you don't need this one. You need these ones." Because it was in the middle of the run.
Oh, yeah.
And then I found out, I saw they had a flyer, like on this old, like, you used to get like weird colored paper stocks for cheaper, and so like comic stores would put their flyers in like blue or pink or yellow paper.
Yeah.
And it was like announcing that there was this drawing of Swamp Thing by Steve Bissett. It's like he was going to be signing at this comic store. I was like, oh, I gotta go to that. And I brought my Swamp Things back to have him sign, and I was obsessed. But I noticed that in one of the comics, he'd drawn this marquee of a movie theater marquee, and it had a poster for Twitch of the Death Nerve, which is a Mario Bava film that was released on video as Bay of Blood, which I had just watched.
Oh, wow.
Like a week before on VHS.
What a moment.
And then Steve asked me to write a new foreword for the second publication of his book, Teen Angels and New Mutants.
This is much later.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
okay.
This is
I got you.
2 weeks ago. And I went back and I looked at that comic because I still have it. And I realized that the other side of the marquee of that same movie theater was Africa Adio, which is a movie that I worked on for DVD.
No way.
12 years earlier.
Wow. That's crazy.
Yeah, I'm like, it's so strange that this which had been such a pivotal comic book for me.
Yeah.
I totally forgot that was there.
Sure.
And I end up working on this film. I worked on that box set for like a year. It was the Mondo Kane box set, and Africa Dio was Africa Blood and Guts was the poster that he had redrawn, and that was the American title, this cut version of it. And that is my favorite film in that box set, and I had completely forgotten until I went back to research it. Yeah. I mean, this is the great thing about comics, right? Is that we're all connected in that way.
Yeah, I do think that one of the glorious things about when you buy something and own it, you can go back to it, and as you change, you go back and you find new things in it that you can connect to and relate to that you didn't when you were younger because you just didn't have enough world experience or whatever. But that's always been one of my great joys, is going back and same with films, watching films and or reading comics or books, and just all of a sudden being like, oh yeah, now this is like so much more deeper on, I'm getting all these nuances that never were shown to me before. So I'm a huge fan.
Well, I don't know that I can end better than that, so I'm not even going to attempt to.
Oh, okay.
So we're going to stop our podcast on comics as fine art right there. We're going to pick up, I think, in the next episode on the impact of graffiti on comics and on pop art. But until then, I thank Mason Booker, our in-house producer and audio engineer, for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's been a blast.
This is Pod Sequentialism. I'm Matt Kennedy, and we'll see you next time.
Melt You, the school at Meltdown, where they teach you the skills to make comic books. Some of the current classes include creating comics, drawing comics for kids, and the art of inking. Coming soon, there will be classes for short film writing, drawing basics, and kids make zines. Go to meltcomics.com and enroll now.